the readings that Cheryl had read this morning, there's that one reading from Hebrews that I really like. It has a very familiar verse within it. I think it's probably very familiar to most of us here, where it says, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understood that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that things which are seen are not made of things which are visible." And faith, it's a simple enough word, isn't it? But it's also a word that holds such immense depth to it too. And faith it's a personal thing too. And the statement made about faith in Hebrews, it's certainly acceptable enough. Faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things unseen. And how we will experience faith and practice faith will likely be unique from one another. It is personal to each of us. And without faith, what would be left in its place? How would you answer that question? What would be left in its place if there were no faith at all? If there is nothing to have faith in? I think for me it would probably be frustration or despair because of a lack of purpose or a lack of being. And I remember reading a story of an American Olympian, and he was a downhill skier, and like all Olympians, he had trained for what would have been probably at least 4 years to earn the right to compete in the 1994 Olympic Games, which was then in Lillehammer, Norway. And there's so much hard work that an athlete goes through in preparing for the Olympic Games. They're just like day in and day out. It's training and practicing, and they're honing their skills so that they're going to be at the absolute peak of their game or of their event. And in a heartbreaking moment for this American downhill skiing, or for this downhill skier, he lost his opportunity to compete as his ski binding broke as he was coming out of the gate. And there was this disappointment that had overtaken him, and this rage as he's swinging his pole at the snow that's around him. But that doesn't going to change his faith, and he trudged back up the hill, and you could just see it was despair and heartbreak that he was experiencing. And what does an athlete like this do after something like that? They train again for the next opportunity in 4 years. Some do that, or do some just give it up altogether? And this is how it is for many Olympic athletes. They come from all over the world for that single moment, and it's a 2-week period of time, but often their event or their routine, whatever it is, it's a moment in time. And if lucky, they're standing at the heights, but for some, the reality, it hits in a broken ski binding or a broken blade or one brief mistake or overcompensation in their race or in their routine or whatever it is, and their dreams then just come crashing in around them. And maybe you've seen it too. Do you remember going way back, if you remember this statement? The thrill of victory and the agony of defeat. Now, anyone probably under 35 doesn't know what that means, but the wide world of sports, that was their thing. And I have watched the ones who lose at the Olympic Games, and then I've wondered too, I wonder if they feel it was still worth it for them, especially when they come so close or something happens that's so disappointing. And do they come to a point where perhaps they doubt the wisdom of following the Olympic dream, of giving up so much time and effort for that slim opportunity of a single moment in glory, or of glory? And I kind of think, maybe in a similar way, in each of our own spiritual journeys, that maybe we share something in common with those Olympic athletes. We all have a starting point in our spiritual lives where there is some kind of spark that is lit within us, and it created this stirring inside of us, and it was the start of something where we began to wonder about God. And we have these questions, and we learn more of them through the written word, and we begin to think, and we begin to pray, and we ask questions, and faith is growing inside of us. And we launch out, we're moving forward in faith, living out what we believe that this stirring is compelling us to do, and that's the Spirit of God. And we begin to explore the potential of a life with God, or of our life with God. And occasionally, too, along the way, we are led up to the heights, to these mountaintop types of experiences where the clouds part and we get this glimpse or an experience of a transforming moment of majesty. And then we're called back down the mountain again, back to the everyday journey where the storms come, and they drench us, and the stones along the path, sometimes they're kind of rocky, and they bruise our feet, and we fight with emotions that are quite different from what we are experiencing up on the mountaintop, and a moment that now feels too short and too fleeting, but we remember those times, we remember it, and we turn it over in our mind, and we're trying very hard to keep those feelings that we had at that time, but maybe the glory fades a bit. And we begin to doubt. And like a despairing Olympic athlete, maybe we think, well, have I come all this way for nothing? Where do I go from here? The faith journey, this is how it can be. And I think that this is perhaps maybe how it was for Abraham at times too. In Genesis 15, he has a question, and it was a troubling question for him. It was a question that had been looming large within his mind for a number of years. You see, you go back to Genesis chapter 12, and Abraham is called to leave his homeland to go to parts unknown. And he did this in response to a promise that God had made to him about him becoming a blessing. And I'll just read it to you from Genesis 12. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And for Abraham, the way for this blessing to be realized would be through an heir, would be through descendants, through a family. And he didn't have an heir. He did not have a son. And this reality had loomed large in his life, and also within the life of his wife too, Sarah. Now through their journey, they had creatively tried to deal with the absence of an heir by ensuring that they would have one eventually through giving the family lineage a little bit of help, if you can remember the story of Abram and Hagar and the slave girl. And that didn't turn out very well, and this was not what God had in mind either. And this absence of an heir, it hung over Abraham, and I just want to briefly look over some of his adventures through the years, and maybe a little one misadventure within it too. Going back again to Genesis 12 and verses 4 through 20, what we find there is that Abraham saves his own skin, and he places his wife in danger by telling the Pharaoh at that time that she was his sister and not his wife. As the Bible tells us, that Sarah was a very beautiful girl, and Abraham feared his life. If Pharaoh wants her, it would be very easy to get rid of him. No one is in the picture. But upon Sarah's removal to the house of Pharaoh, not only is she at risk, but any heir produced at this point would have been of uncertain parentage. Now, the next two chapters of Genesis, we see something very different. We see the growth within Abraham's character, and he seemed to be learning along the way, and he's learning to trust, and following that debacle in Egypt, he grew in faith, and we find him in Genesis 13 generously giving his nephew, or allowing his nephew Lot to take the more fertile land on the plain of Jordan when they decide to part ways, as you read through that story. And then in Genesis 14, he becomes this war hero. And through all of these adventures, and through these years, Abraham and Sarah still remain childless. They still remain without kids. And so when God appears to him now in Genesis chapter 15 and says, "Fear not, Abram, I am your shield, your reward will be great." And Abraham is looking into the future, and he's now an even older man, and does not see this unsatisfactory childless state changing. You know, the promise of God's provision and protection, that was all very well and very good. But what is in his heart is looming large. And you can hear it in what he says. How can any of this be, paraphrasing a bit here, that I would become a great nation? A great nation would be made up of many people. It would be made up of descendants, for goodness sake, but you have given me no offspring. And then God asks Abraham to accompany him outside. And he says, you look at the stars, and you try and count those stars, and as many as you can count, that is going to be the number of your descendants. Trust me. And Abraham did trust. And it was his doubt that got him there. It was his questioning. And Abraham, he had his mountaintop experiences, but he had more than his share of moments at the bottom of the mountain too, or down the side. And perhaps the most difficult thing about faith is that it requires a level of patience and persistence that does not come naturally to any of us. And we're not the only ones who find a faithful life an enormous challenge. As you read on through Hebrews 11, that Cheryl had read bits and pieces from, Hebrews 11 is filled with people who found faith to be a challenge, and yet ultimately they found it also to be the most satisfying way to be. I think that doubt can be one of the greatest allies in our faith journey, and maybe sometimes doubt is given a bit of a bad rap, and I can appreciate that too, because doubt can take you to poor places, I suppose, and also too, maybe some of you would agree that I think that we've been perhaps brought up generally to feel guilty about the fact that we have doubts and have struggled with doubt or have questions. But the thing is that doubt can also give way to a kind of growth that brings us to a strength that I think is really unmistakably divine. But people are uncomfortable with doubt because it raises unanswered or unanswerable questions. The thing is, though, it makes us think. And that isn't all bad either, is it? And the Bible has a few things to say about doubt, too. How many of you remember the story of Peter when he was walking on water? Do you remember that story? And he began to sink, and Jesus said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" It's in Matthew 14. And then later in chapter 21 of Matthew, he said to his disciples this. He says, if you have faith and do not doubt, you can say to this mountain, "Go, throw yourself into the sea," and it will be done. And then there's that other moment when he appears to his disciples after the resurrection, after he had risen from the dead, and they were frightened beyond belief, thinking that what they were seeing was a ghost, and Jesus said to them, "Why are you troubled? And why do doubts rise in your mind?" And then there's Thomas, and who could ever forget Thomas, right? He refused to accept the disciples' word that Jesus was risen until he put his own hands or his own fingers into the wounds of Jesus. And you remember these words where Jesus said to him, "Put your finger here, see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Now these are all examples of the humanity of the disciples, and somewhere along the way, I think legalistic proclamations were made of them. Stop doubting and believe. Have faith, for goodness sakes, and do not doubt. And then we've used these kinds of things to berate ourselves. Oh, me of little faith. Why can't I believe perfectly and without so many questions? But is this really the context of those passages? Do they really show that kind of a condemning attitude? You see, when Peter began to sink, Jesus reached out his hand to him, and when the disciples couldn't fathom the reality of the resurrection, Jesus reassured them, invited them to touch. And he even ate a fish in front of them, or ate fish in front of them to demonstrate that he really was indeed alive. And when Thomas came before him, Jesus exposed his hands and he exposed his side and offered Thomas the opportunity to see and feel for himself. Jude 1 verse 22 says this, "Be merciful to those who doubt." God does not condemn us for questioning or turn an angry face away from our longing to discover the truth or to discover more of the truth, to discover more of his truth. And to us, as to Thomas, Jesus reveals his wounds to us and he says, "Come, just come, touch me, have your faith renewed." And God is merciful to those who doubt. And so we need to extend that same kind of grace, that same kind of mercy to not only others, but to ourselves too. Peter, he wanted to know Christ so much that he took this enormous risk, risking his very life really, to try and walk on water, held up only by the word of Jesus. And when he began to sink, Jesus didn't let him drown. But he reaches out and he touched him and he drew him to the surface and back into the embrace of the Lord who knew him, the Lord he loved. And Thomas found the courage to be honest. He found the courage to express what the other disciples were far too afraid to say. And he revealed his heart no matter what the cost. And Jesus responded to his tenacity by inviting him to draw close. And whether Thomas actually did touch his hands and side, we don't know for sure. But in spiritual terms, certainly he touched Jesus and his love and faith were deepened. Honest doubt, I don't think honest doubt is for the faint of heart. It's way easier and way safer to keep your questions to yourself and to pretend to be spiritual and full of faith, especially where we feel we need that to be, where we need to be safe and feel where we need to be protected for fear of what others may think. But those who dare to doubt or who dare to question, who dare to ask questions, will come away from the encounter with their faith strengthened and with the touch of God upon them. I think that faith demands that kind of diligence, that kind of seeking diligence. And I think that the parable that Jesus told, that also read for us from Luke 12, it accentuates this. Those two words, be ready. Because the master may come at any time, at an hour least expected. Be ready with an expectant heart that seeks to know more of God, that seeks to know more of Jesus, that yearns to discover more than what we knew before. And don't let inhibitions get in the way, inhibitions such as preconceived notions of God, or fear that we fall too short, or that we're too simple or not spiritual enough. I don't think we should ever come to a place where we're too afraid to seek through asking all kinds of questions. I think that refusing to question or to listen or to think past a certain point or through some of our long-held beliefs, perhaps they can have tragic consequences if we don't think through them from time to time. I think there's a sacredness in asking questions, and asking all kinds of questions. Whatever it is that is on our mind, I don't think we're going to get the answers or be able to move forward if we do not ask questions that are pertinent to the Christian faith or to our faith. Because I think it's through that an honest seeker of God will either discover or rediscover the glory and wonder of God in new and also in refreshing ways too. I think one of the biggest surprises to the servants in the parable, the time when the master returned, did that surprise them? Probably would, even if they had maybe been ready. Just the appearance of the master may have been a surprise still. But another startling surprise was that when the master would eventually appear, he comes dressed for service, where the servants are reclined at the table, or allowed to recline at the table because the master had come to serve, had come to love. And this is Jesus, and this is the King of Love, open, inviting, and accepting arms. So we can be truthful. Nothing is hidden from God anyway, and there's nothing that is going to shock him. And I think God is big enough to be able to handle our honesty, and the Lord is merciful with those who search, with those who ask questions, with those who doubt, with those who don't feel like they have it all together, because they're the ones who are seeking in humility and in honesty. And I think the love breaks forth in the presence of honesty. So reach out with all of your questions. Really, all of them? Or just a few? Bring them all. Look to the stars. Count them. And as many as you can count, that's how many questions you can bring. Bring to the Lord. So ask and search and inquire. And the wounds of Jesus, the wounds of love, they're held out before you and I. And so we can come with an open heart and with a spirit that doesn't fear, and come and touch the hands that bled for you. Draw near to his wounded side and embrace your questions as men and women of faith throughout the ages have, where you can surrender your every care and have your faith renewed. Because he is calling, and he is waiting, and he's always, always ready to meet you there, wherever you are. So in closing, let's sing the song, The River. And Kara and Lauren and Darlene will lead us in that.